The house on Maple Street was more than brick and mortar to Eleanor. It was a tapestry of memories, woven from decades of love, loss, and quiet triumphs. She had raised her son, David, within its walls, watched him take his first steps in the sunlit kitchen, and later, nursed her husband, George, through his final days in the bedroom upstairs. The house was her heart's anchor, and she had always dreamed of passing it on to David, a gift to cradle his new life with his fiancée, Claire. But that dream shattered the night Claire pushed her both physically and emotionally while David stood by, silent. Eleanor sat in her armchair, the one George had loved, its faded upholstery a comfort against the storm brewing in her chest. The argument had erupted 2 weeks ago, but its echoes still rattled her bones. Claire, with her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, had stormed into the house, demanding Eleanor sign over the deed before the wedding. "It's only practical," Claire had said, her voice clipped, her eyes cold. "We need to start our life. And this house is just sitting here, wasted on you alone." Eleanor had recoiled, not at the words, but at the venom behind them. She had spent months preparing the house for them, polishing the oak floors, repainting the walls in soft creams and blues, imagining their future children playing in the backyard. She had even begun packing her own belongings, ready to move to a small apartment nearby to give them space. But Claire's demand felt like a theft, not a request. "This house is my life," Eleanor had said, her voice trembling. "It's not just a thing to be taken." The argument escalated quickly. Claire's voice rose, her hands gesturing wildly. And then, in a moment of fury, she shoved Eleanor against the kitchen counter. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to send a jolt of shock through Eleanor's frail frame. She caught herself, gripping the counter, her heart pounding not from pain, but from betrayal. She looked to David, her only child, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his mouth a thin line, but he said nothing. Not a word to defend her, not a step to intervene. His silence cut deeper than Claire's push. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the photo frame in her lap now, the one showing the house in its prime, with George's roses blooming out front. She had planned to give them the deed as a wedding gift, a symbol of her love and trust. But that night, something broke inside her. The house wasn't just a gift. It was her legacy, her story. And if David couldn't stand up for her, if Claire saw her only as an obstacle, then perhaps they didn't deserve it. She rose from the armchair, her movements slow but deliberate, and walked to the kitchen. The papers were still there, tucked in a drawer, the deed, the legal forms she'd had drawn up. She stared at them, her resolve hardening. By morning, she would call her lawyer. The wedding gift was off. The days that followed were a blur of quiet determination. Eleanor didn't tell David or Claire about her decision. She wanted to see if they'd noticed the shift in her, if they'd sensed the gravity of what they'd done. But David's calls were brief, his texts perfunctory, and Claire didn't reach out at all. Eleanor began to wonder if she'd been wrong about her son all along. Had she raised a man who valued convenience over family? Had she misjudged the depth of his love? She spent her mornings tending to the garden, George's roses still thriving despite the years. Each petal felt like a whisper of his presence, urging her to hold fast to her dignity. She remembered the nights they'd spent planning their future, how they'd saved every penny to buy this house, how they'd laughed and cried within its walls. It wasn't just a house. It was a testament to their resilience. And Claire's careless entitlement, David's spineless silence, they cheapened it. One afternoon, as Eleanor pruned the roses, her neighbor, Mrs. Larson, leaned over the fence. "You look troubled, dear," the older woman said, her eyes kind but piercing. Eleanor hesitated, then poured out the story of the argument. The push. David's silence. Mrs. Larson listened, nodding, her face a map of wrinkles and wisdom. "You're not wrong to feel betrayed," Mrs. Larson said. "But don't let anger make your choices. That house is your heart, Eleanor. If you give it up, make sure it's for the right reasons, not spite." Eleanor nodded, but her heart was still raw. She didn't want to act out of spite, but she couldn't ignore the wound. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, drafting a letter to David. She wrote of her love for him, her pride in the man she'd hoped he'd become, and her pain at his silence. She didn't mention the house. Not yet. She sealed the letter and set it aside, unsure if she'd ever send it. The wedding was 3 months away, and Eleanor knew she couldn't avoid them forever. Claire's parents were hosting an engagement party soon, and Eleanor was expected to attend. The thought of facing Claire's smug smile, David's averted eyes, made her stomach churn. But she also knew she couldn't hide. She had to confront this, not just for herself, but for the memory of George, for the life they'd built together. As she lay in bed that night, the house creaked around her, a familiar symphony of old wood and memories. She thought of George's laughter, David's childhood giggles, the quiet moments that had made this place home. And she wondered if she could find a way to forgive, or if some betrayals ran too deep. The engagement party was held at Claire's parents' sprawling estate, a stark contrast to Eleanor's modest home. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, and guests in tailored suits and glittering dresses mingled with forced smiles. Eleanor felt out of place, her simple navy dress a quiet rebellion against the opulence. She clutched her purse, where the unsent letter to David lay folded, a weight she couldn't ignore. David found her early in the evening, his smile tentative. "Mom, you came," he said, his voice softer than usual. He looked older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper. But Eleanor couldn't tell if it was guilt or exhaustion. She wanted to ask why he'd stayed silent, why he hadn't defended her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, her lips tight. Claire approached moments later, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Eleanor, so glad you could make it," she said, her tone syrupy, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the fight. Eleanor's chest tightened, but she forced a polite smile. She wouldn't cause a scene, not here. Not now. The evening dragged on, filled with toasts and laughter that felt hollow to Eleanor. She watched David and Claire move through the crowd, their hands linked, their smiles practiced. She wondered if David even realized what he'd lost in her eyes. As the night wore on, she slipped outside to the garden, needing air, needing space. Claire's mother, Margaret, found her there, sitting on a stone bench under a canopy of roses. "You seem quiet tonight," Margaret said, settling beside her. Eleanor hesitated, then shared a softened version of the story, not the push, not the full betrayal, but enough to convey her hurt. Margaret listened, her face unreadable. "Claire can be intense," Margaret said finally. "But she loves David. And I think she respects you, even if she doesn't show it well." Eleanor wanted to believe her. But respect didn't shove someone against a counter. Respect didn't demand a family's legacy as if it were owed. When Eleanor returned home, The house felt emptier than ever. She wandered through the rooms, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories. She stopped at the mantel, where a photo of David as a boy grinned back at her, his eyes bright with trust. She wondered where that boy had gone. The next morning, she called her lawyer. "Mr. Thompson, I want to cancel the transfer of the house," she said, her voice steady. "It's not going to David and Claire." Mr. Thompson didn't ask questions. He'd known Eleanor long enough to trust her judgment. He promised to handle the paperwork and suggested she consider other options for the house, perhaps a trust or a sale. Eleanor wasn't ready to decide. For now, she just wanted to reclaim her power. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor threw herself into small projects, repainting the guest room, sorting through George's old books. Each task felt like a reclaiming of her space, her story. But David's silence persisted. He called once, asking about her health, but never mentioned the fight. Claire sent a single text, a curt reminder about wedding invitations. Eleanor didn't respond. One evening, as she sat knitting in the living room, the doorbell rang. It was David, alone, his face drawn. "Can we talk?" he asked, and Eleanor's heart leapt, then sank. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He sat on the couch, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I know I messed up, Mom," he said finally. "I didn't know what to say that night. Claire was out of line, but I didn't know how to stop it." His voice cracked, and Eleanor saw a glimpse of the boy from the photo, vulnerable and lost. But she also saw the man who'd let her down. "You didn't just not know what to say, David," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You chose not to say anything. You chose her over me." The words hung between them, heavy and true. David's shoulders slumped, but he didn't argue. For the first time, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he understood. Maybe he could change. But hope wasn't enough. Not yet. /Xi artifact. Xi artifact underscore ID equals B into 47F14751 B759. Artifact underscore version 30 equals 45054C39556 B489760447C3C. Title equals My DIL pushed me in a fight. My son stayed silent, so I canceled their wedding gift. The house, Part 3. TXT, content type equals text/markdown. David's visit left Eleanor restless. She wanted to forgive him, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But the hurt was a stubborn knot in her chest. She spent the next day cleaning the attic, sorting through boxes of old letters and photos, each one a reminder of the life she'd built with George. She found a card David had made for her at age 10, scrawled with "I love you, Mom" in crooked crayon. She pressed it to her heart, tears falling. She didn't tell David about the house, and he didn't ask. Perhaps he assumed it was still theirs, a given in his future with Claire. Eleanor wasn't ready to reveal her decision. She needed time to understand her own heart. Instead, she focused on the present, on reclaiming her strength. She joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at a local shelter. Small steps, but they made her feel alive again. One afternoon, while serving meals at the shelter, she met a young woman named Lila, barely 20, with a quiet strength that reminded Eleanor of herself decades ago. Lila had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes, never knowing stability. Over coffee, Lila shared her dream of owning a home someday, a place to call her own. Eleanor listened, her heart stirring. She began to wonder if the house could mean more to someone like Lila than to Claire, who saw it only as a prize. The wedding drew closer, and Eleanor's resolve wavered. She wanted to believe David could change, that Claire might soften. She invited them to dinner, hoping for a chance to talk, to heal. Claire arrived with a forced smile, David with cautious eyes. The meal was tense, the conversation stilted. Eleanor tried to steer it toward memories David's childhood, George's love for the house, but Claire redirected every topic to the wedding, the guest list, the venue. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Eleanor took a deep breath. "I need to know something," she said, looking at David. "Do you understand why I was hurt that night? Do you see what it meant to me?" David shifted, his face tight. Claire cut in before he could speak. "Eleanor, we've moved past that. Let's not dwell on it." Eleanor's patience snapped. "No, Claire, we haven't moved past it. You pushed me. You demanded my home." And David stood there and let it happen. The room fell silent. David's eyes dropped to his hands, and Claire's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, Eleanor saw a flicker of shame in Claire's expression, but it was fleeting. "I'm sorry you felt hurt," Claire said finally, her voice flat. "But we're a family now. We need to focus on the future." Eleanor looked at David, waiting for him to speak, to take a stand. But he only nodded, his silence louder than ever. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew then that the house would never be theirs. The next morning, she called Mr. Thompson again. "I want to explore other options for the house," she said. "Maybe a donation, or a trust for someone who needs it." She thought of Lila, of the countless others who dreamed of a home. The idea felt right, like a seed taking root. As the weeks passed, Eleanor threw herself into her new purpose. She met with a local nonprofit that helped young adults transition out of foster care, discussing how the house could be used. She imagined it as a safe haven, a place where someone like Lila could build a life. The thought brought her peace, a way to honor George's memory and her own. But David's silence lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. She sent him the letter she'd written, hoping it would spark something in him. He called the next day, his voice heavy. "I read your letter, Mom," he said. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this." Eleanor listened, her heart torn between love and resolve. "Start by being honest," she said. "With me. With Hawkins yourself." David's call left Eleanor with a fragile hope, but it was tempered by doubt. She had raised him to be kind, to stand up for what was right. But his silence during the fight with Claire had shaken her faith in him. Still, his apology was a start, a crack in the wall between them. She didn't mention the house, not wanting to taint the moment with practicalities. Instead, she asked him to visit again, alone, to talk more. He agreed, but his voice carried a hesitation that made her wary. Eleanor threw herself into her new project with the nonprofit. She met with their director, Sarah, a warm woman with a knack for listening. Together, they crafted a plan to turn the house into a transitional home for young adults aging out of foster care. Eleanor envisioned the rooms filled with laughter, the kitchen bustling with shared meals, the garden a place of solace. She pictured Lila there, finding the stability she'd never had. The thought warmed her, a counterbalance to the ache of David's betrayal. She began preparing the house, clearing out old furniture, painting walls in bright, welcoming colors. Each change felt like a step toward letting go, not of the house itself, but of the pain tied to it. She kept David's childhood drawings, George's books, a few cherished photos, but let go of things that no longer served her. The process was cathartic, a shedding of weight she hadn't realized she carried. David came over a week later, his posture stiff as he sat in the living room. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice low. "I was wrong to stay silent. I was scared. Claire's so strong-willed, and I didn't want to lose her." Eleanor listened, her heart caught between compassion and frustration. She understood fear, but she couldn't erase the image of him standing in the doorway, mute, as Claire's hands met her shoulders. "Fear isn't an excuse," she said gently. "You're my son, David. I needed you to see me, not just her." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and for a moment, she saw the boy who'd clung to her after nightmares. She wanted to reach for him, but the distance between them held her back. The conversation shifted to the wedding, now just weeks away. David spoke of his hopes, his fears, his love for Claire despite her flaws. Eleanor listened, searching for the man she'd raised. She told him about her work with the nonprofit, though not yet about the house. His eyes lit up at the idea, a spark of the David she knew, but she wasn't ready to trust it fully. After he left, Eleanor sat in the garden, George's roses fragrant around her. She thought of Lila, of the young people who'd find a home here. The house was taking on a new life, one that felt truer to its spirit than Claire's demands ever had. She met with Sarah again, finalizing plans for the trust. The paperwork was complex, but Eleanor felt a clarity she hadn't in months. One evening, Lila visited, her eyes wide as she toured the house. "This place feels like hope," she said, her voice soft. Eleanor smiled, her heart full. She saw the house through Lila's Isis sanctuary, not a prize. The decision to donate, it felt final now, a gift to the future rather than a tether to the past. But David's silence still haunted her. She invited him and Claire to the house again, hoping for a breakthrough. Claire was quieter this time, her usual bravado muted. David seemed eager to connect, asking about the nonprofit, the garden, the memories. Eleanor shared stories of George, of their life here, hoping to remind him of what the house meant. Claire listened, her face unreadable, and Eleanor wondered if she'd ever truly understand. As they left, David hugged her, his embrace tentative but warm. "I'm trying, Mom," he whispered. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, but trust was a fragile thing, and she wasn't sure it could be rebuilt before the wedding. The wedding was 2 weeks away, and Eleanor's heart was a battlefield of love and resolve. She finalized the trust paperwork, officially designating the house as a transitional home for the nonprofit. Sarah and Lila helped her move hero. The wedding was 2 weeks away, and Eleanor's heart was a battlefield of love and resolve. She finalized the trust paperwork, officially designating the house as a transitional home for the nonprofit. Sarah and Lila helped her move out the last of her unnecessary belongings, keeping only the essentials that held deep sentimental value: George's favorite armchair, a box of David's childhood crafts, a few photo albums. The house was transforming, its walls now painted in warm yellows and soft greens, ready to welcome its new purpose. Eleanor felt a quiet pride in this shift, but the rift with David gnawed at her, a wound that refused to heal. She invited David to the house one last time before the wedding, hoping for closure. He arrived alone, his shoulders hunched, his eyes carrying a weight she hadn't seen before. "Mom, I've been talking to Claire, he said, sitting across from her in the living room. She's sorry, but she doesn't know how to say it. She's not good with vulnerability. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised but unmoved. An apology unspoken was no apology at all. I've been thinking about the house, David continued, his voice hesitant. I assumed it was ours, but I realize now how much it means to you. I should have stood up for you that night. I was weak. His admission was raw, and Eleanor saw the boy she'd raised, grappling with the man he'd become. She wanted to forgive him, to pull him close. But trust was a fragile bridge, and she wasn't sure it could hold. I'm giving the house to the nonprofit, she said, her voice steady but soft. It'll be a home for young people like Lila, who need a fresh start. It's what your father would have wanted, a legacy of kindness, not conflict. David's face fell, a mix of shock and guilt. He'd expected the house, assumed it was his inheritance. The truth stung, and Eleanor let it. She needed him to understand the cost of his silence. I didn't know, he said, his voice breaking. Mom, I get why you're doing this. I let you down. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her heart aching at the warmth of his touch. They sat in silence, the house around them whispering memories of better days. Eleanor thought of George, his laughter filling these rooms, and felt a pang of loss, not for the house, but for the family she'd hoped to preserve. The next day, Eleanor met Lila at the nonprofit's office. Lila's eyes sparkled as she talked about the house, her dreams of stability now within reach. I've never had a place that felt like mine, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor smiled, seeing the house's future through Lila's hope. They walked through the rooms together, planning where beds would go, how the kitchen would serve communal dinners. Lila hugged her, a fierce, grateful embrace, and Eleanor felt a purpose she hadn't known she needed. The wedding loomed, and Eleanor wrestled with whether to attend. She wanted to support David, but Claire's unacknowledged actions cast a shadow. She called Mrs. Larson, her neighbor, for advice. Go, Mrs. Larson urged. Not for Claire, but for David. Show him what grace looks like. Eleanor nodded, knowing she'd go for the boy who'd once drawn her crayon hearts, not the man who'd stood silent. The day of the wedding was crisp. The autumn leaves a riot of color. Eleanor wore her navy dress again, simple but dignified, and arrived at the venue grand hall adorned with white roses. David spotted her immediately, his face lighting up. He hugged her tightly, whispering, "Thank you, Mom." Claire approached, her expression guarded but softer than before. "Eleanor," she said, pausing, "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The words were stiff, but they were there, and Eleanor nodded, accepting them not as full atonement, but as a start. The ceremony was beautiful, David's vows earnest, Claire's voice trembling with sincerity. Eleanor watched from the back, her heart torn between pride and pain. When David looked her way, she smiled, a small gesture of love. The reception was lively, but Eleanor kept to herself, sipping wine and watching her son dance with his bride. She felt George's presence in the quiet moments, his strength urging her to hold fast to her choices. Back home, the house was nearly ready for its new residents. Eleanor packed the last of her things, preparing to move to her apartment. She lingered in the garden, George's roses vibrant against the autumn chill. She felt at peace, knowing the house would live on, not as a gift to one, but as a home for many. Eleanor's new apartment was small but cozy, its windows overlooking a park where children played. She hung David's childhood drawings on the walls, their crooked lines a reminder of simpler times. The house on Maple Street was now fully in the nonprofit's hands, its rooms filled with the laughter of young adults like Lila, who moved in just days after the wedding. Eleanor visited often, bringing cookies and stories, watching the house become the sanctuary she'd envisioned. Lila thrived there, her quiet strength blossoming in a space that felt like home. David and Claire returned from their honeymoon, and Eleanor invited them to her apartment. The visit was tentative, but warmer than before. Claire brought a small gift-framed photo of the family in the Maple Street garden. "Years ago. I want to do better," Claire said, her eyes meeting Eleanor's for the first time with genuine regret. David nodded, his hand on Claire's shoulder. "We both do," he said. Eleanor felt the knot in her chest loosen. Not fully, but enough to breathe easier. They talked for hours, sharing memories of George, of the house's many lives. David spoke of his guilt, his resolve to be a better son. "I should have spoken up," he said again, and Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You're speaking now?" she replied, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't forgiveness. Not entirely, but it was a step toward healing. Eleanor joined the nonprofit's board, working closely with Sarah to expand the program. The house became a model for others, a beacon of hope for those who'd never had a home. Lila, now a resident, organized game nights in the living room, filling it with joy Eleanor hadn't heard in years. One evening, Lila showed her a garden plan, roses included, and Eleanor smiled, knowing George's legacy lived on. Months later, David and Claire invited Eleanor to dinner at their new home, a modest condo they'd bought themselves. The evening was light, filled with laughter and stories. Claire shared her own vulnerabilities, admitting her fear of losing control had driven her actions. David spoke of his growth, his commitment to family. Eleanor listened, seeing glimpses of the son she'd raised, the man she'd hoped he'd become. The house on Maple Street stood strong, its walls echoing with new voices, new dreams. Eleanor visited often, her heart full as she watched young people build lives within its embrace. She kept in touch with David, their bond mending slowly, stitch by stitch. Claire grew softer, her edges smoothed by time and effort. Eleanor felt the weight of the past lift. Not gone, but lighter. One spring morning, Eleanor sat in the garden with Lila, the roses in full bloom. They sipped tea, the air warm with promise. "This house saved me," Lila said, her eyes bright. Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling. The house was no longer hers, but its spirit was George's love, her resilience, a legacy of second chances. She thought of David, of Claire, of the family they were rebuilding. And as the sun warmed the petals, Eleanor knew she'd made the right choice. Not out of anger, but out of love.